The late afternoon sun slanted through the grimy windows of the Silver Dollar Saloon, casting long shadows across the sawdust floor where Master Chen worked in quiet concentration. His weathered hands, marked by decades of labor and secrets, moved with practiced precision as he diced vegetables for the evening stew. At 67 years old, Chen had found peace in these simple rhythms. The steady thunk of his cleaver against the cutting board provided a meditation he had once found only in the mountain temples of his youth. Deadwood had grown hard around him in the 3 years since his arrival. The railroad promised prosperity, but prosperity for some meant desperation for others. Chen understood this balance better than most. He had seen empires rise and fall, watched men's hearts turn black when their bellies grew empty and their pride wounded. The saloon door swung open with a harsh creak, and Molly Fitzgerald entered carrying a tray of empty glasses. The young Irish woman had kind eyes and calloused hands from honest work. Unlike many in town, she had never looked at Chun with suspicion or disdain. She treated him simply as what he appeared to be, an old man who cooked good food and asked for little. "Chun," she called to him, wiping sweat from her brow. "The Henderson table is asking for more of your dumplings. They say they've never tasted anything like them back in Missouri." Chen smiled, the expression deepening the lines around his pale gray eyes. This pleased him more than Molly could know. Food was love made tangible, care transformed into sustenance. In his former life, he had fed the spirits through meditation and discipline. Now he fed the body through simpler gifts. "I will prepare fresh ones immediately," he replied, his accent soft but his English careful and precise. Perhaps they would enjoy the ginger sauce as well. Molly nodded and moved toward the main room, where the evening crowd was beginning to gather. Chen could hear the familiar sounds of men seeking escape from their troubles. Cards shuffling, glasses clinking, conversations growing louder with each drink. Most nights, these sounds brought him comfort. Tonight, they carried an edge that made his old instincts stir. The saloon door crashed open again, this time with violence rather than purpose. Jake Morrison stumbled inside, his face flushed red from whiskey and something darker. Behind him came his usual companions, 5 men who had lost their mining jobs when the shaft played out last month. Chen recognized them all. Tom Bradley with his nervous laugh and quick fists. Pete Kowalski, who still wore his mining clothes like armor against a world that had discarded him. Frank Walsh, whose dead eyes spoke of too many disappointments. Billy Cartwright, barely 20 and angry at everything. And Dutch Henry, whose real name nobody knew and whose temper everybody feared. Morrison scanned the room like a predator seeking prey. His gaze fell on Chun through the kitchen doorway, and something ugly flickered across his features. Chen had seen that look before, in other times and other places. It was the look of a man who needed someone weaker to blame for his own failures. "Well, looky here, boys," Morrison announced loudly enough for the entire saloon to hear. "Our little yellow friend is still here, still taking work that belongs to real Americans." The conversations in the saloon grew quieter. Some men shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Others leaned forward with the anticipation that trouble brings to those who live safely outside its reach. Chun continued cutting vegetables, his movements unchanged, but his awareness expanded to encompass every corner of the room. "Jake, please," Molly said from behind the bar. "Chen's been nothing but good to this place. His cooking brings in customers." Morrison turned toward her with a smile that held no warmth. "Well now, Miss Molly, isn't that sweet? You're defending your little pet Chinaman. Tell me, what other favors does he do for you?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a poorly vented fire. Chen set down his cleaver and looked directly at Morrison for the first time. The younger man was perhaps 40, with the build of someone who had once done honest labor but had let anger and drink soften his edges. His eyes were bloodshot from whiskey, but beneath the alcohol Chun read deeper currents. Fear, shame, the desperate rage of a man who had lost his place in the world. "There is no need for such words," Chen said quietly. "Miss Molly shows kindness to all who work here." Morrison's laugh was harsh and brittle. "Listen to that, boys. The Yellow Devil thinks he can lecture us about how to talk to white women. But if you think this is just another story about bullying, stay with me. Comment below what country you're listening from, because these tales of courage travel everywhere. What you're about to witness will remind you that some people are far more than they appear. Pete Kowalski stepped closer to the kitchen doorway. Maybe it's time we taught him some manners, Jake. Show him how real men handle disrespect. Chin studied each face carefully, reading their intentions like a scholar reads ancient texts. Morrison was the leader, but his control was fragile. Pete and Dutch were truly dangerous, men who enjoyed causing pain. Tom would follow but lacked conviction. Billy was young and stupid, which made him unpredictable. Frank seemed the most reluctant, which meant he might be reached with reason. I seek no trouble, Chin said, turning back to his work. There is room in this town for all who wish to live peacefully. Morrison slammed his fist on the bar. Peacefully? You think you can just waltz into our country and take our jobs and talk about peace? You think we're going to stand by while foreigners steal the bread from our children's mouths? The other customers were leaving now, settling their tabs quickly and heading for the door. Even the bartender had disappeared into the back room. Only Molly remained, her face pale but her jaw set with stubborn courage. Mr. Morrison, she said firmly, Chin earns his wages same as anyone. He works harder than most and causes less trouble than some I could mention. Morrison's face darkened further. You taking his side against your own kind, girl? Chin felt the familiar weight of choice settling on his shoulders. He had faced this moment many times in his long life, though never quite like this. In the monastery, the choice had been between meditation and action. In the wars, between survival and honor. Here, in this frontier saloon that smelled of sawdust and broken dreams, the choice was between the peace he had sought and the protection of innocence. He watched Morrison's hand drift toward the gun on his hip, saw the way the other men spread out slightly, unconsciously adopting the positions they would need if violence erupted. Felt Molly's fear like a physical presence in the room. Perhaps, Chin said slowly, it would be better if you returned when you have had time to reconsider your words. Morrison's eyes blazed with the fury of a man who had found a target for all his frustrations. Reconsider? You yellow dog. I'll reconsider putting you in the ground where you belong. The words fell into silence. Even the piano had stopped playing. Chin set down the vegetables he had been preparing and turned to face Morrison fully. For just a moment, something flickered in his pale eyes, something that made Pete take an unconscious step backward. But Morrison was too drunk and too angry to recognize the warning signs. Time to teach that yellow devil a lesson he won't forget, Morrison snarled to his companions. Tonight we show this town what happens to foreigners who don't know their place. The evening air carried the bite of approaching winter as Chun made his way down Deadwood's Main Street toward Patterson's general store. His canvas sack hung light on his shoulder, soon to be filled with the supplies he needed for tomorrow's meals. The wooden sidewalk creaked under his feet, a familiar sound that had become part of his evening ritual. 3 blocks to the store, select his ingredients with care, 3 blocks back to the saloon. Simple, peaceful, safe. He should have recognized the trap. Morrison and his 5 companions emerged from the shadows between buildings like wolves surrounding a lone traveler. They had been drinking steadily since their confrontation at the saloon, and the whiskey had transformed their anger into something more dangerous. Chin saw them and immediately understood his situation. The street was empty. The store had closed early. No witnesses. No help. Well, Morrison said, his words slurred but his intent crystal clear. Look what we found wandering around after dark. Lost, old man. Chin stopped walking and assessed his options. Behind him, Tom Bradley had moved to block his retreat. To his left, Dutch Henry leaned against a hitching post, hand resting casually on his gun. Pete Kowalski and Frank Walsh flanked Morrison, while young Billy Cartwright bounced nervously on his feet like a dog eager for a fight. I am simply purchasing supplies, Chin replied calmly. I have no quarrel with any of you. Morrison laughed, a harsh sound in the gathering darkness. No quarrel? You got a quarrel whether you want one or not, Chinaman. See, me and the boys been talking about how this town's got problems. How decent white folks can't find work while foreigners take jobs that ain't theirs to take. The gang began to close the circle tighter. Chin remained still, his breathing steady, his hands relaxed at his sides. To an observer, he might have appeared resigned to his fate, but his pale gray eyes tracked every movement, catalogued every threat, calculated distances and angles with the precision of long experience. Pete Kowalski stepped forward and knocked the canvas sack from Chen's shoulder. The bag hit the dirt street with a soft thud. Perhaps it's time you found yourself a new town, old man. Maybe somewhere they appreciate your kind. Chen bent slowly to retrieve his bag. As his fingers touched the canvas, Morrison's boot came down hard, pinning the sack to the ground. Chen looked up at Morrison's leering face and spoke with quiet dignity. Please remove your foot. Or what? Morrison demanded. You gonna make me? Dutch Henry had drawn closer, his breath reeking of rot-gut whiskey. He grabbed Chen's arm and yanked him upright with unnecessary force. The old man's feet barely maintained purchase on the uneven ground. You got some nerve, yellow boy, Dutch growled. Coming into our town, taking our jobs, thinking you can talk back to white men like you're our equal. Chen felt the familiar weight of choice pressing down on him once again. These were not soldiers or bandits or men driven by ideology. They were simply afraid and angry people who had chosen to direct their fear at someone they perceived as weaker. In the monastery, the masters had taught that such men could sometimes be reached with patience and wisdom. But Chen had learned through bitter experience that wisdom was often mistaken for weakness by those who understood only force. I have taken nothing that was not freely given, Chen said evenly. I work hard for my wages and trouble no one. Frank Walsh, who had remained silent until now, shifted uncomfortably. Come on, Jake, he said quietly. Maybe we've made our point. Old man's not bothering anybody. Morrison whirled on Frank with fury. You going soft on me, Walsh? You forgetting who your friends are? Frank stepped back, his brief moment of conscience crushed by the weight of group loyalty. Billy Cartwright, eager to prove himself, moved behind Chen and shoved him forward into Morrison's waiting hands. Your kind don't belong here, Morrison snarled, grabbing the front of Chen's simple cotton shirt. This is America, not some yellow heathen country. Chen felt the fabric tear slightly in Morrison's grip. He looked directly into the younger man's bloodshot eyes and spoke with calm certainty. I am an American citizen. I have papers. Papers? Tom Bradley laughed from his position blocking the street. Papers don't make you white, Chinaman. Papers don't make you one of us. Morrison's grip tightened, and Chen could smell the whiskey on his breath mixed with something fouler. The scent of a man who had lost his way and blamed the world for his failures. Maybe it's time we taught you some manners, Morrison said. Show you how we handle smart-mouthed foreigners in this town. But if you think this story is just about an old man being outnumbered by bullies, stay with me. Comment what country you're listening from, because these tales of standing up to injustice reach every corner of the world. What's about to happen will remind you that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who look the most harmless. Pete Kowalski had picked up Chen's canvas bag and was examining it with mock interest. What's in here, old-timer? Opium? Secret yellow devil potions? Without waiting for an answer, Pete upended the bag and shook out its contents. Chen's carefully saved coins scattered across the dirt street, glinting in the lamplight from the store windows. The money represented weeks of careful saving, small amounts set aside from his modest wages. Well, looky there, Dutch Henry said with cruel delight. Yellow boy's got himself a little treasure hoard. What say we help ourselves to a finder's fee? The men scrambled in the dirt for the coins while Morrison maintained his grip on Chen's shirt. Chen watched his savings disappear into their pockets and felt something ancient and dangerous stir in the depths of his soul. Not anger, exactly. Something colder. Something that had been sleeping for 20 years, but now showed signs of waking. Please, Chen said quietly. I need that money for supplies. For food. Morrison's face twisted into a mask of mock sympathy. Oh, you need the money? Well, why didn't you say so? Boys, give the Chinaman back his money. The gang erupted in laughter. Tom Bradley flipped a single coin back toward Chen's feet, where it landed in the dirt beside a pile of horse droppings. There you go, old-timer, Tom said with a grin. Every penny you deserve. Chen stared at the coin in the filth and felt the last threads of his patience beginning to fray. He had endured much in his long life. Poverty, exile, the destruction of everything he had once held sacred. But there was something about this casual cruelty, this deliberate humiliation, that cut deeper than physical pain. Morrison seemed to sense the change in Chen's demeanor and pressed his advantage. He grabbed a handful of Chen's long hair, the cue that marked him as different, and yanked his head back at a painful angle. You know what I think? Morrison said, his voice thick with malice. I think it's time this yellow rat learned what happens to his kind when they forget their place. The pain in Chen's scalp was sharp and immediate, but it was nothing compared to the deeper violation of having his dignity stripped away in public. His cue was not merely hair. It was tradition, identity, a connection to ancestors and culture that these men could never understand. Chen spoke without raising his voice, but something in his tone made Billy Cartwright take a nervous step backward. Release me. Morrison's laugh was ugly and triumphant. Release you? Boy, I'm just getting started. He twisted Chen's hair tighter, forcing the old man to his knees in the dirt. The other gang members closed in, forming a tight circle of leering faces and cruel intentions. Pete Kowalski drew back his foot and kicked Chun in the ribs, not hard enough to break bones, but with enough force to drive the breath from his lungs. Chun absorbed the blow without crying out, his body folding around the impact like water flowing around a stone. That's for taking jobs from real Americans, Pete snarled. Frank Walsh looked increasingly uncomfortable, but made no move to intervene. Tom Bradley cracked his knuckles in anticipation. Dutch Henry spat into the dirt near Chen's hands. Morrison leaned down close to Chen's ear, his voice a whisper of pure venom. You listening, yellow boy? This is just the beginning. Tonight you learn your place. Tomorrow you pack up your heathen belongings and get out of our town. You understand me? Chen remained silent, his eyes fixed on the ground before him. But something had changed in his posture, in the way he held his shoulders. The transformation was subtle, almost invisible, but Tom Bradley noticed it and felt an unexpected chill run down his spine. I said, do you understand me? Morrison shouted, jerking Chen's head back again. When Chen finally looked up, his pale gray eyes held something that made Morrison's grip slacken slightly. Not fear, not pain, something infinitely more dangerous. I understand perfectly, Chen said quietly. Morrison released Chen's hair and stepped back, suddenly uncertain. For a moment, the old man kneeling in the dirt had looked like someone else entirely. Someone who might be very, very dangerous. But the moment passed, and Chen simply gathered himself slowly to his feet, his movements careful and deliberate. He brushed the dirt from his clothes with the same methodical precision he used when preparing food. Smart choice, old man, Morrison said, his bravado returning. Real smart. Now get out of here before we decide to finish this lesson proper. Chen bent and retrieved the single coin from beside the horse droppings, wiping it clean on his sleeve before placing it carefully in his pocket. Then he looked at each man in turn, his gaze lingering just long enough to memorize their faces completely. Without another word, Chen walked away down the darkened street, his footsteps steady and sure on the wooden sidewalk. Behind him, the gang watched him go with a mixture of satisfaction and inexplicable unease. Morrison tried to shake off the strange feeling that had overcome him when he looked into the old man's eyes. Just a scared old Chinaman, he told himself. Nothing more. But as Chen disappeared into the shadows, Tom Bradley couldn't escape the feeling that they had just made a terrible mistake. The next evening brought no peace to the Silver Dollar Saloon. Chen had returned to his kitchen after the encounter in the street, his movements carrying a different quality than before. Where once his actions had been marked by gentle meditation, now they held the precision of controlled readiness. He prepared the evening meals with the same care as always, but Molly noticed his eyes swept the main room more frequently, cataloging faces and positions with an awareness that seemed almost military in its thoroughness. The saloon filled slowly as darkness settled over Deadwood. Miners ending their shifts, cowboys passing through town, businessmen seeking liquid escape from their daily frustrations. The usual crowd, seeking the usual comforts. Chen found solace in the familiar rhythms, the steady demands of feeding hungry people. Perhaps Morrison and his companions had satisfied their need for cruelty. Perhaps the confrontation was over. He should have known better. The saloon doors burst open with a violence that made every conversation stop. Morrison strode through the entrance like a conquering general, his 5 companions spreading out behind him in a formation that spoke of deliberate planning. They were drunk, but not stumbling drunk. This was the calculated intoxication of men who had used alcohol to fuel their courage while maintaining enough control to execute their intentions. Morrison's eyes swept the room and found Chen visible through the kitchen doorway. A smile split his face, but it held no warmth. only the satisfaction of a predator that has cornered its prey. Well, well, Morrison announced to the room at large. Look who decided to stay in town after all. Guess our yellow friend didn't get the message last night. The other customers began to shift nervously. Some headed for the door, recognizing the signs of trouble and wanting no part of it. Others settled deeper into their chairs, anticipating entertainment. Chun continued his work, but Molly could see the change in his posture. He stood straighter, his movements more economical, like a machine preparing for action. Jake, please, Molly called from behind the bar where she was polishing glasses. You're scaring off the paying customers. Morrison turned toward her with exaggerated courtesy, removing his hat in a mocking gesture. Why, Miss Molly, we're paying customers too. Ain't that right, boys? We got money to spend. Pete Kowalski slammed a handful of coins on the nearest table, coins that Chun recognized as his own stolen savings. Drinks all around. Barkeep. The finest whiskey in the house. We're celebrating. Celebrating what? Molly asked, though her tone suggested she didn't really want to know. Our civic duty, Dutch Henry replied with a cruel laugh. Cleaning up the neighborhood. Making Deadwood safe for decent white folks. The remaining customers were leaving now, abandoning half-finished drinks and card games in their haste to escape. Even the piano player gathered his sheet music and headed for the back door. Within minutes, the saloon held only Molly, Chun, and the 6 men who had come looking for trouble. Tom Bradley moved to block the front entrance while Frank Walsh positioned himself near the back door. Billy Cartwright was practically bouncing with nervous energy, his hand resting on his gun butt. The formation was deliberate, practiced. They had planned this. Chun set down his cleaver and stepped to the kitchen doorway, his pale gray eyes taking in the tactical situation with the swift assessment of long experience. 6 armed men, 2 exits blocked, 1 innocent woman in immediate danger. The mathematics of violence, equations he had hoped never to calculate again. Morrison swaggered toward the bar, his boots loud on the sawdust floor. You know, Miss Molly, me and the boys been thinking. This establishment's got itself a reputation problem. Decent folk don't want to eat food prepared by foreign hands. Don't know what kind of heathen poisons he might be putting in there. That's ridiculous, Molly replied. But Chun could hear the fear creeping into her voice. Chun's food is the best in town. Half your customers come here specifically for his cooking. Morrison leaned across the bar, close enough that Molly had to endure the whiskey on his breath. Well, maybe it's time those customers learned to appreciate good American cooking instead. He reached across the bar with sudden violence, grabbing Molly's wrist and jerking her forward. She stumbled, catching herself against the bar top, her face pale with shock and fear. Let go of me, she said, trying to pull away, but Morrison's grip tightened. Chun took a step forward, and Morrison's attention snapped toward him like a compass needle finding magnetic north. That's it, yellow boy. Come on out here where we can all see you. Release her, Chun said quietly. She has done nothing to you. Morrison's laugh was harsh and brittle. Nothing. She's been harboring a foreign devil, serving his poison to good Americans. I'd say that's plenty. Pete Kowalski had moved around behind the bar, cutting off Molly's escape routes. She was trapped between the 2 men, her eyes wide with a fear that was rapidly transforming into something more dangerous. Molly Fitzgerald had not survived 3 years on the frontier by being helpless. You're drunk, she said with forced calm. Let me go and get out of my saloon before you do something you'll regret. Our saloon? Dutch Henry corrected with mock surprise. Funny, I don't see your name on any deed. Maybe it's time this place had some proper American management. Morrison's grip on Molly's wrist was leaving marks, his fingers pressing deep enough to bruise. She winced but refused to cry out, her Irish stubbornness asserting itself despite her fear. Chun felt something ancient and terrible stirring in the depths of his soul. The same thing that had awakened slightly in the street the night before, but stronger now. Much stronger. For 20 years, he had suppressed this part of himself, buried it beneath layers of meditation and peaceful philosophy. But there were some things that could summon it from the deepest sleep. The abuse of innocence was one of them. Please, Chun said, his voice carrying a note that made Tom Bradley look toward him with sudden attention. There is no need for this. Release the lady and state your grievance with me directly. Morrison twisted Molly's arm, drawing a sharp intake of breath from her. His eyes never left Chun's face, feeding on the old man's obvious distress. "My grievance?" Morrison snarled. "My grievance is that foreign scum like you think you can come into our country and take what belongs to real Americans. My grievance is that decent white women have to work alongside yellow devils who should be on the next ship back to whatever heathen land spawned them." Chen took another step forward, and his movement was different now. Where before he had moved like an old man careful of his joints, now he moved like flowing water, each step deliberate and precise. Billy Cartwright noticed the change and felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. "I was born in Canton," Chen said quietly, "but I became an American citizen 13 years ago in San Francisco. I have harmed no one. I seek only to live peacefully and earn my bread honestly." Morrison's face twisted with rage. "Papers don't make you American, you yellow dog. Blood makes you American. Land makes you American. Fighting for this country makes you American." Chen's pale gray eyes seemed to look through Morrison, seeing not just the man but the fear and desperation that drove him. "I have fought for this country," Chen said quietly. "Perhaps more than you know." There was something in the way he said it that made the room grow quiet. Even Morrison seemed momentarily uncertain, as if he had heard something in the old man's voice that his conscious mind couldn't quite process. But the moment passed, and Morrison's grip on Molly tightened. Frank Walsh moved closer, emboldened by his leader's apparent control of the situation. "Fighting?" Morrison laughed, but the sound was forced. "What would a yellow coward know about fighting for America? You probably spent the war hiding in some laundry, washing white men's clothes." Chen's eyes went completely still. When he spoke, his voice carried a quality that made every man in the room pay attention, even if they couldn't understand why. "I served as a scout for the Union Army from 1861 to 1865, Chen said with quiet precision. "I was present at Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg, and the Wilderness. I saved the lives of more American soldiers than you will meet in your lifetime." The claim was so unexpected, so completely at odds with their preconceptions, that for a moment even Morrison was speechless. Pete Kowalski laughed nervously. "That's the biggest load of horse manure I ever heard," Pete said. "No yellow devil ever fought for the Union." Chen reached slowly into his shirt and withdrew something that had been hidden against his chest. A small leather pouch, worn smooth by years of handling. From it, he extracted a tarnished silver medal attached to a faded blue ribbon. "Congressional Medal of Honor," Chen said simply. "Awarded for actions at Missionary Ridge, November 1863. The silence in the saloon was complete. Even Morrison stared at the medal with undisguised shock. Tom Bradley was the first to find his voice. "That's impossible," Tom whispered. "They don't give those to men like me?" Chen asked, his voice still quiet, but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "Perhaps your assumptions about men like me are incomplete." Morrison's face had gone pale, but his grip on Molly remained firm. "So what if it's real? So what if you were some kind of war hero? That was 20 years ago, old man. You're nothing but a broken-down cook now." But even as he spoke the words, Morrison could see that something fundamental had changed in the old man standing before him. Chen no longer looked like a victim. He looked like something far more dangerous. Chen carefully placed the medal back in its pouch and returned it to his shirt. When he looked up again, his pale gray eyes held depths that made Billy Cartwright take an involuntary step backward. "You are correct," Chen said with deadly calm. "That was 20 years ago. I came to this town seeking peace. I found work that brought me satisfaction. I asked nothing more than to be left alone." He paused, and in that pause, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "But you have chosen to threaten an innocent woman," Chen continued. "You have chosen to bring violence to a place of peace. You have chosen poorly." Morrison tried to laugh, but the sound came out strained. Big words from an old man. "What are you going to do about it?" Chen's response was not words, but action. He moved with a speed that defied belief, covering the distance between the kitchen and the bar in 3 fluid strides. Morrison barely had time to register the movement before Chen's hand closed around his wrist with iron strength. "Release her," Chen said, and his voice had become something entirely different. Gone was the soft accent, the careful politeness. What remained was the voice of absolute command, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Morrison tried to jerk away, but Chen's grip was immovable. The old man's fingers found pressure points with surgical precision, and Morrison's hand went numb, his grip on Molly failing involuntarily. Molly stumbled away from the bar, rubbing her bruised wrist and staring at Chun with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. The gentle cook who had fed her countless meals had been replaced by someone she didn't recognize. Tom Bradley was the first to break from his paralysis, his hand moving toward his gun. Chin's head turned toward him with predatory focus. "I would not recommend that course of action," Chin said quietly. There was something in his pale gray eyes that made Tom's hand freeze halfway to his weapon. Something that spoke of violence so swift and certain that resistance would be not just futile but fatal. Morrison was clutching his numb hand, his face a mask of pain and confusion. "What are you?" he whispered. Chun released his wrist and stepped back, but his posture remained that of a coiled spring, ready to explode into action at the first sign of threat. "I am a man who wished only for peace," Chun replied. "But I am also a man who will not stand by while innocents suffer." The 6 members of Morrison's gang found themselves facing a transformation they could not have imagined. The old Chinese cook was gone, replaced by something that made their primitive instincts scream warnings they were too proud to heed. Morrison tried to rally his courage and his followers. "He's just one old man," Morrison said, but his voice shook. "There's 6 of us." Chun smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, but it was not the gentle expression Molly remembered from their daily interactions. This smile held the cold promise of winter storms. "Yes," Chun said quietly. 6 of you. That seems almost fair." And in that moment, every man in the room understood that they had awakened something that should have been left sleeping. Morrison's hand was beginning to regain sensation, pins and needles shooting through his fingers as feeling returned. He flexed his fingers experimentally, amazed that the old man had been able to render his hand completely useless with what appeared to be nothing more than a firm grip. The implications of this small demonstration were beginning to penetrate his whiskey-clouded mind, but pride in the presence of his followers prevented him from acknowledging the growing voice of caution. "You got lucky, old man," Morrison said, trying to inject confidence into his voice. "Caught me off guard with some kind of trick. Won't happen again." Chin remained motionless in the center of the saloon, his posture relaxed but alert. To Molly, watching from her position behind the bar, he looked like a different man entirely. Gone was the slight stoop that had made him appear older than his years. Gone was the careful deference that had characterized his every interaction with customers. What remained was something elemental and dangerous, a predator wearing the mask of domesticity. Dutch Henry had moved to flank Chin from the left, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. The old man noticed the movement without turning his head, his awareness encompassing the entire room with an intensity that made Billy Cartwright's skin crawl. 6 against 1, Dutch said with forced bravado. "You may have some tricks, Chinaman, but you ain't got enough to handle all of us." Chin turned his head slightly, fixing Dutch with his pale gray eyes. The look lasted only a moment, but it was enough to make the larger man take an involuntary step backward. There was something in that gaze that spoke of violence so swift and certain that Dutch's primitive survival instinct screamed warnings he was too proud to acknowledge. "You are correct," Chin said quietly. 6 against 1 is not a fair fight. Morrison laughed harshly, mistaking Chin's words for an admission of weakness. "Damn right it's not fair. Should have thought of that before you put your hands on me." Chin's response was to do something that defied every expectation they had built around his character. He smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered features into something that made Tom Bradley's blood run cold. "You misunderstand me," Chin said with deadly calm. 6 against 1 is not fair to you." The words hung in the air like the calm before a thunderstorm. Frank Walsh, who had been moving to cut off Chin's retreat toward the kitchen, found himself frozen by the absolute certainty in the old man's voice. Morrison's face twisted with rage and humiliation. Big words from a yellow devil who's about to learn what American justice looks like. He lunged forward with surprising speed, his right fist aimed at Chin's jaw with the full weight of his body behind it. It was a powerful blow, delivered with the experience of countless saloon brawls, enough to drop most men where they stood. Chin was not most men. The old man moved like flowing water, his body shifting just enough to let Morrison's fist pass harmlessly through empty air. As Morrison stumbled forward, thrown off balance by his own momentum, Chin's hand shot out with surgical precision. His fingers found a cluster of pressure points along Morrison's extended arm, and the gang leader's entire right side went numb. Morrison crashed into a table, sending cards and poker chips scattering across the sawdust floor. He tried to push himself upright, but his right arm refused to obey his commands. For the first time since entering the saloon, genuine fear flickered across his features. "What did you do to me?" Morrison demanded, cradling his useless arm against his chest. Chin straightened to his full height, and for the first time the men facing him could see exactly what they were up against. Where before they had seen a bent old cook, now they faced someone who carried himself with the bearing of absolute confidence. His movements were economical, precise, like a machine built for a single purpose. "I have temporarily disrupted the flow of energy through your arm," Chin explained with clinical detachment. "The effect will wear off in approximately 30 minutes. If you had attempted to draw a weapon, the disruption would have been permanent." Pete Kowalski rushed forward, his own fists raised in a boxer's stance. Chin waited until Pete was within striking distance, then moved with impossible speed. His right hand traced a complex pattern through the air, striking Pete 3 times in rapid succession. To the watching men, it looked like a single flowing motion. To Pete, it felt like being hit by lightning. Pete's legs folded beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor like a marionette with severed strings. He was conscious, his eyes wide with shock and confusion, but his body refused to respond to his desperate commands. "Pressure points," Chin said matter-of-factly, looking down at Pete's paralyzed form. "A technique taught in the Shaolin Temple for subduing opponents without permanent injury. He will recover full mobility within the hour." Billy Cartwright's hand was shaking as he drew his revolver, the barrel wavering as he tried to aim at the old man who had just disabled 2 of his companions with casual efficiency. "Don't come any closer," Billy said, his voice cracking like an adolescent. "I'll shoot. I swear I'll shoot." Chin turned toward him with the same calm expression he wore when discussing the weather. "Billy, is it not? You are perhaps 19 years old. You have never killed a man. The weight of that action would destroy you far more completely than any physical injury I might inflict. How do you know my name?" Billy whispered, the gun still trembling in his grip. "I make it my business to know the names of those who threaten innocent people," Chin replied. "Just as I know that Tom Bradley has a wife and 3 children in Colorado. Just as I know that Frank Walsh sends money to his elderly mother in Chicago. Just as I know that Dutch Henry is wanted for murder in Kansas and believes his past is hidden." The men stared at him in stunned silence. The old Chinese cook had somehow learned their most carefully guarded secrets, had made it his business to understand exactly who they were and what drove them. Tom Bradley found his voice first. "That's impossible. You've been here 3 years, never talked to anybody except everyone," Chin finished quietly. "The cook who prepares your food, the man who listens to your conversations when you think he doesn't speak English well enough to understand. You would be amazed what people will say in front of someone they consider invisible." Dutch Henry had drawn his gun as well, but his hands were steadier than Billy's. Years of violence had given him a familiarity with weapons that the younger man lacked. "Enough talk," Dutch snarled. "I don't care what kind of fancy moves you got, old man. Bullets faster than any man." Chun regarded the gun with the same detached interest he might show to a mildly interesting insect. "You are welcome to try," he said simply. The invitation was delivered with such calm confidence that Dutch hesitated. Something about the old man's demeanor suggested that he was not afraid of the gun. More disturbing still, he seemed to welcome the opportunity to demonstrate why the weapon posed no threat. Frank Walsh, who had remained silent through the confrontation, finally spoke. "Jake, maybe we should listen to him. Cut our losses and walk away." Morrison struggled to his feet, his right arm still hanging useless at his side. His face was flushed with humiliation and rage, but underneath both emotions, a cold certainty was beginning to form. They had made a terrible mistake. "Walk away," Morrison said through gritted teeth. "After he's humiliated us in front of half the town? After he's put his hands on me like I'm some kind of animal?" Chin's pale gray eyes fixed on Morrison with laser intensity. "You humiliated yourselves," he said quietly. "I merely demonstrated the consequences of your choices." Morrison's left hand moved toward the gun on his hip, a motion that Chun tracked with predatory focus. The old man's body shifted slightly, weight settling into a stance that Molly didn't recognize, but that somehow conveyed lethal readiness. "I would strongly advise against that action," Chen said, his voice carrying a note of absolute authority. Morrison's hand froze halfway to his weapon. There was something in Chen's tone that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the primitive survival instincts buried deep in every man's brain. "You want to know who I really am?" Chen asked, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he moved from his position in the center of the room. His steps were perfectly controlled, each footfall placed with deliberate precision as he walked toward the kitchen. "I was born in the mountains of Fujian province," Chen said as he moved. "My parents were killed when I was 7 years old, murdered by bandits who burned our village. I was taken to the Shaolin Temple, where the masters saw something in me that even I did not understand." He reached the kitchen doorway and paused, his hand resting on the frame. Behind him, the 6 men watched with fascination and growing dread. "For 30 years, I trained in the ancient arts," Chun continued. "Combat, meditation, healing, the reading of men's souls. I became one of the temple's most accomplished masters, responsible for training the warriors who would defend the innocent and preserve the peace." Chen disappeared into the kitchen for a moment, and the men heard the soft sound of something being moved. When he emerged, he carried a simple canvas bundle that had been hidden behind a barrel of flour. "When the imperial soldiers came to destroy the temple, I was one of the few who escaped," Chen said as he unwrapped the bundle with reverent care. "I came to America seeking peace, hoping to leave behind the life of violence that had been thrust upon me." The last fold of canvas fell away, revealing a weapon that drew gasps of recognition from the watching men. It was a dao, a Chinese sword, but unlike any blade they had ever seen. The steel seemed to drink in the lamplight, its edge so sharp it appeared to cut the very air around it. "This blade has taken 43 lives," Chen said, lifting the sword with the familiarity of long practice. "Bandits, murderers, men who preyed upon those too weak to defend themselves. Each death was a necessity, each killing a burden that weighs upon my soul." He held the weapon before him in a traditional guard position, and his entire bearing transformed once again. Now he looked like what he truly was, a master warrior, one of the deadliest men alive, who had chosen to hide his true nature behind the mask of a simple cook. "I sought peace in this place," Chen said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I found work that brought me joy, people who treated me with kindness, a life free from the violence that had defined my existence. You have chosen to destroy that peace." Dutch Henry raised his gun with desperate speed, but Chun was already moving. The sword flashed through the air in an arc of silver light, and Dutch's revolver was sliced cleanly in half, the barrel clattering to the floor while the grip remained in his numbed fingers. The movement had been so fast that most of the men hadn't even seen it happen. One moment Dutch had been holding a weapon, the next he was staring at a piece of useless metal while a sword blade rested gently against his throat. "I do not wish to kill you," Chen said quietly, "but I will not allow you to harm innocent people. The choice is yours." Tom Bradley looked at his paralyzed companions, at the terror in Billy's eyes, at the sword that had appeared at Dutch's throat faster than thought itself. For the first time since following Morrison into this confrontation, he understood exactly what they were facing. They weren't fighting an old cook. They were fighting a legend. The sword at Dutch Henry's throat remained perfectly still, its razor edge reflecting the lamplight in a thin line of silver fire. Dutch could feel the cold metal against his skin, could sense the absolute steadiness of the hand that held it. One wrong move, one sudden breath, and the blade would open his throat like parchment. But what terrified him more than the weapon was the complete calm in Chen's pale gray eyes. This was not the fury of an angry man. This was the professional assessment of someone who had killed before and would kill again if necessary. Tom Bradley still held his unfired weapon, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely maintain his grip. The casual efficiency with which Chun had disarmed Dutch had shattered every assumption he built about the old Chinese cook. This wasn't luck or trickery. This was decades of training distilled into movements too fast for the human eye to follow. "Put the gun down, Tom," Chun said without turning his head, his attention remaining fixed on Dutch. "You cannot draw and fire before I can complete the stroke that will end your friend's life. Simple mathematics." Tom's weapon wavered between Chun and the floor. His mind raced through possibilities, angles, desperate chances that might give him an advantage. But every scenario ended the same way. Dutch would be dead before Tom could pull his trigger, and then the sword would find him with the same supernatural speed. The gun fell from Tom's nerveless fingers, hitting the sawdust floor with a muffled thump. Wise choice, Chun acknowledged. Now step away from the weapon and place your hands behind your head. Tom obeyed, his movements slow and careful. He understood now that he was dealing with someone who could kill him before he could blink, someone who was choosing not to do so out of mercy rather than inability. Billy Cartwright still held his revolver, but the barrel was pointed at the floor and his entire body was shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. At 19, he had thought himself tough, ready for anything the frontier could throw at him. Now he faced the reality that he was a frightened boy playing at being a man, and the game had turned deadly serious. You as well, Billy, Chun said gently. Lower your weapon and step back. This does not have to end in blood. I can't, Billy whispered, his voice breaking. If I give up my gun, you'll kill us all. Chun's expression softened slightly, the first hint of compassion he had shown since the confrontation began. Look around you, Billy. Pete and Morrison are disabled but breathing. Dutch's throat remains uncut despite having the opportunity. If I wished you dead, would you still be standing? Billy looked at Pete, who was beginning to regain some movement in his extremities, flexing his fingers experimentally. Morrison sat slumped against an overturned table, cradling his numb arm, but very much alive. The evidence was undeniable. Chun could have killed them all in the time it took to demonstrate his capabilities, yet he had chosen restraint. The young man's gun hand slowly lowered until the weapon pointed harmlessly at the floor. Then, with a sob of relief and terror, he let it fall from his trembling fingers. Chun nodded approvingly. Wisdom often comes through fear, but it is wisdom nonetheless. You may yet live to see your 20th birthday if you learn from this night. Frank Walsh had remained motionless throughout the entire confrontation, his weapon still holstered, his face pale with the understanding of just how close they had all come to death. Now he raised his hands slowly, palms visible, making no sudden movements. I surrender, Frank said quietly. I want no part of this madness. Chun evaluated him for a moment, reading the sincerity in his posture and tone. You showed wisdom earlier when you suggested retreat. I will remember that. With Dutch neutralized and the others disarmed, only Morrison remained as a potential threat. The gang leader had managed to prop himself against the wall, his left hand fumbling awkwardly for the gun on his hip. His right arm hung useless, but desperation and humiliation drove him to attempt what reason should have prevented. Chun sensed the movement without seeing it, his awareness encompassing every corner of the room with supernatural precision. The sword moved away from Dutch's throat in a flowing motion, and Chun turned to face Morrison with the fluid grace of a dancer. Morrison's left hand closed around his gun grip, just as Chun's blade came to rest against his wrist. The steel was so sharp that Morrison could feel it parting the first layer of skin without any pressure being applied. Draw that weapon, Chun said with quiet certainty, and you will never use that hand again. Morrison's eyes blazed with impotent fury, but his hand released the gun as if it had suddenly become red hot. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. Chun could sever tendons and bones faster than Morrison could clear leather. You can't kill us all, Morrison snarled, though his voice lacked conviction. Someone will see. Someone will come. Chun stepped back, lowering his sword but maintaining his ready stance. I have no intention of killing any of you. Death is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. You are angry, frightened men who have made poor choices. Death would teach you nothing. Then what do you want? Frank Walsh asked, genuine curiosity mixing with his fear. Chun looked around the room, taking in the overturned furniture, the scattered cards, the men who had come seeking easy prey and found a predator instead. His pale gray eyes settled on each face in turn, reading character and intent with the skill of long experience. I want you to understand the consequences of your actions, Chun said. You came here tonight seeking to intimidate and harm innocent people. You have instead learned that appearances can be fatally deceiving. Perhaps this lesson will prevent future tragedies. He moved toward the center of the room with measured steps, the sword held in a traditional ready position. The weapon seemed to be an extension of his body, as natural in his hands as kitchen utensils had been earlier in the evening. "You," he said, pointing the blade toward Tom Bradley. "You have a wife named Rebecca and 3 children. Sarah is 8, Michael is 6, and little Emma just turned 4. What do you think happens to them if you die in a saloon brawl far from home?" Tom's face went white. "How do you know their names?" "I listen," Chen replied simply. "You speak of them often when you drink. You miss them terribly. Yet here you are, risking everything for what? The approval of men who would forget your name before your blood dried on this floor?" Tom looked around at his companions, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. Morrison, consumed by bitterness and hate. Dutch, a killer who enjoyed causing pain. Pete, a brute who solved problems with his fists. Billy, a frightened boy pretending to be a man. Frank, a decent man who had fallen in with the wrong crowd. What kind of future was he building for his children by associating with such people? "You," Chin continued, turning toward Billy. "You send letters to your mother in St. Louis. She believes you are working as a clerk in a general store, earning honest wages, and staying out of trouble. What would she think if she knew you spent your evenings threatening innocent women?" Billy began to cry then, great choking sobs that shook his entire frame. His mother had sacrificed everything to give him the chance for a better life in the West. Instead, he had fallen in with men who solved their problems with violence and blamed others for their failures. "And you," Chen said, his gaze falling on Dutch Henry. "You believe your past is hidden, but I know about the family you murdered in Dodge City. I know about the children you left orphaned. I know about the bounty on your head." Dutch's face went gray with shock and terror. "That was 5 years ago. Nobody knows about that." "I know," Chen said quietly. "The question is what I choose to do with that knowledge. Do I turn you over to the law, or do I give you the chance to make different choices?" Morrison struggled to his feet, using his good arm to lever himself upright. His face was a mask of pain and humiliation, but underneath both emotions, a cold understanding was beginning to form. "What do you want from us?" Morrison demanded. Chen lowered his sword completely, though his posture remained alert and ready. "I want you to leave this place and never return. I want you to find honest work and stop blaming others for your failures. I want you to remember that there are consequences for choosing to prey upon the innocent." "And if we refuse?" Dutch asked, though his voice held no defiance. Chen smiled, and the expression was somehow more terrifying than any threat he could have spoken. "Then you will discover that my restraint has limits." He moved toward the kitchen with the same flowing grace that had marked his combat, but stopped at the doorway to address Molly, who had watched the entire confrontation in stunned silence. "Are you injured?" he asked, his voice gentle once again, the deadly warrior replaced by the caring man she had known. Molly shook her head, though she was still rubbing the bruises on her wrist where Morrison had grabbed her. "I'm fine," she said softly. "But Chun, what you just did, how did you?" "I was something else before I became a cook," he replied. "Something I hoped never to be again. But some situations require tools I wish to keep buried." Pete Kowalski had regained enough mobility to sit up, though his movements were still unsteady. The sensation was slowly returning to his limbs, accompanied by tingling pain that reminded him just how completely he had been at Chen's mercy. Morrison used his good arm to help Pete to his feet, then looked around at his defeated gang. 3 of them had been rendered helpless without Chen breaking a sweat. The others had surrendered without firing a shot. The old Chinese cook had systematically dismantled 6 armed men with a combination of skill and psychological warfare that left them all questioning everything they thought they knew about strength and weakness. "This isn't over," Morrison said, but the words lacked any conviction. Chen regarded him with the same calm expression he wore when discussing the weather. "Yes, it is. You have seen what I am capable of when I choose restraint. You do not wish to discover what I might do if that restraint were removed." He gestured toward the door with his sword. "Take your men and leave. Do not return to this saloon. Do not approach Miss Molly again. Find honest work or find another town, but do not mistake my mercy for weakness." Morrison wanted to argue, wanted to salvage some shred of dignity from the disaster his pride had created. But the evidence was overwhelming. They had picked a fight with someone so far beyond their capabilities that resistance was not just futile, but suicidal. One by one, the gang members gathered their weapons and stumbled toward the door. Billy moved like a sleepwalker, his face streaked with tears. Tom kept looking back at Chun with a mixture of gratitude and terror. Frank Walsh paused at the threshold. "Thank you," Frank said quietly, "for showing mercy we didn't deserve." Chun nodded acknowledgement. Mercy is not earned. It is given freely, or it has no value. When the last man had left, Chun carefully cleaned his blade and wrapped it in its canvas covering. The transformation back to the gentle cook was gradual but complete. His posture settled into the familiar slight stoop. His movements became careful and measured once again. But Molly could see that something fundamental had changed. She would never again look at him and see just a harmless old man. "They won't be back," Chun said with quiet certainty. "How can you be sure?" Molly asked. "Because they have learned the most important lesson a bully can learn," Chun replied, returning his sword to its hiding place behind the flour barrel. "That there is always someone stronger. Always someone who will not bend. Always someone willing to stand between predators and their prey." He began setting the overturned furniture upright, his movements once again those of a man concerned with simple, domestic tasks. Molly watched him work, marveling at the complete transformation she had witnessed. "Chun," she said softly, "what you did tonight, that was incredible. But it was also terrifying. How do you live with that kind of power?" Chun paused in his work, his weathered hands resting on the back of a chair. "Power is neither good nor evil, Molly. It simply exists. The choice lies in how it is used. I have spent my life learning to use power in service of others rather than in service of myself." He looked at her with eyes that held depths of experience she was only beginning to understand. "Violence is a tool," he said quietly. "Sometimes necessary, always regrettable. But compassion is a way of life. Compassion is what allows us to remain human even when we must do inhuman things." Molly nodded, though she wasn't sure she completely understood. What she did understand was that she had been protected by someone extraordinary, someone who had chosen to hide his true nature in order to live peacefully among people who would never comprehend what he truly was. The saloon was quiet now, empty except for the two of them and the lingering scent of fear and violence. Chun returned to his kitchen and began preparing tea, the familiar ritual helping to restore some sense of normalcy to the evening. Tomorrow, he knew, word of what had happened would spread throughout Deadwood. Some would come seeking to challenge the mysterious Chinese warrior. Others would come seeking his protection or wisdom. A few might come simply to satisfy their curiosity about the cook who had revealed himself to be something far more dangerous. But tonight, there was peace. Tonight, an innocent woman was safe. Tonight, justice had been served without the finality of death. It would have to be enough. Sheriff Marcus Dalton arrived at the Silver Dollar Saloon 20 minutes after the last of Morrison's gang had stumbled into the night. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Deadwood, and half a dozen witnesses had seen the 6 men leaving the establishment in various states of distress. Billy Cartwright had been crying openly. Tom Bradley walked like a man who had seen his own death and been granted an unexpected reprieve. Morrison himself had cradled his arm and kept looking over his shoulder as if expecting pursuit by demons. The sheriff found Chun in his kitchen, calmly preparing tea as though nothing unusual had occurred. Molly sat at a small table near the stove, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup, her face still pale from the evening's events, but her composure slowly returning. "Evening, Chun," Dalton said, removing his hat as he entered the kitchen. "Heard there was some trouble here tonight." Chun looked up from his preparations with the same gentle expression he had worn during their previous encounters. "Nothing that could not be resolved, Sheriff. Would you care for some tea?" Dalton studied the old man's face, searching for signs of the violence that had reportedly taken place. Chun appeared completely calm, his clothing neat and undisturbed, his weathered hands steady as they worked. If not for the overturned furniture in the main saloon and Molly's obvious distress, Dalton might have dismissed the reports as frontier exaggeration. "I'll pass on the tea, thanks. Mind telling me what happened here?" Molly started to speak, but Chun raised a gentle hand to forestall her. "Some men came seeking trouble," Chun said simply. "They found more than they expected." Dalton waited for elaboration that didn't come. The sheriff had dealt with Chun numerous times over the past 3 years, and the old man had never shown any inclination toward violence or even harsh words. He was known throughout Deadwood as a quiet, hard-working cook who minded his own business and caused no trouble for anyone. That's a pretty sparse account, Chun, Dalton said. Morrison and his boys looked like they'd seen the devil himself. Tom Bradley's hands were shaking so bad, he could barely light a cigarette. Chun finished preparing his tea and sat across from Molly at the small table. They threatened Miss Molly, he said quietly. I convinced them that such behavior was unwise. Convinced them how? Dalton pressed. For the first time, Chun's pale gray eyes met the sheriff's directly, and Dalton felt an unexpected chill run down his spine. There was something in that gaze that spoke of depths he had never suspected, experiences that went far beyond anything he might have imagined about the quiet Chinese cook. I reminded them that appearances can be deceiving, Chun said. Molly finally found her voice. Sheriff, they grabbed me. Morrison hurt my arm. Chun stopped them. He saved me from God knows what they might have done. Dalton examined the bruises on Molly's wrist, clear finger marks that told their own story of Morrison's grip. His expression hardened as he imagined what might have happened if Chun hadn't intervened. How exactly did you stop 6 armed men, Chun? Dalton asked, his tone carrying the weight of official curiosity. Chun sipped his tea thoughtfully before answering. I demonstrated that they had made incorrect assumptions about my capabilities. The sheriff waited for more details, but Chun offered nothing further. Dalton had questioned enough men after violent encounters to recognize evasion when he heard it, but he also understood that some stories were more complex than they appeared on the surface. Morrison's claiming you assaulted him, Dalton said finally. Says you attacked him without provocation. Chun's expression didn't change. Mr. Morrison is free to file whatever charges he believes appropriate. I will answer any questions you have about my actions tonight. The calm confidence in Chun's voice was unshakable. Dalton had seen guilty men try to bluff their way through interrogations, but this wasn't bluffing. This was the serene certainty of someone who had nothing to hide and nothing to fear from the truth. Sheriff, Molly interjected, Morrison and his gang came here drunk and looking for trouble. They threatened Chun, destroyed his property yesterday, and tonight they grabbed me and made threats about what they might do. Chun didn't start anything. He finished it. Dalton studied both faces, reading the sincerity in Molly's account and the untroubled acceptance in Chun's demeanor. In his experience, the victim of an unprovoked assault didn't usually display such complete calm immediately afterward. I'll need to get statements from both of you, the sheriff said. But based on what I'm hearing and what I saw of Morrison's condition, I'm guessing this falls under self-defense and defense of others. Chun nodded acknowledgement. I will provide whatever information you require, Sheriff. Though I hope this incident can be resolved without further violence. There was something in the way Chun said it that made Dalton believe the old man could indeed ensure no further violence occurred, though the sheriff couldn't quite understand how. Over the following days, word of the confrontation spread through Deadwood like wildfire. The details grew more elaborate with each telling, but the core facts remained consistent. Morrison's gang had terrorized the wrong man, and they had paid a price that none of them would ever forget. Chun continued his work in the saloon kitchen as though nothing had changed, but the people of Deadwood began to see him differently. Some approached him with new respect, speaking more carefully in his presence and treating him with the deference usually reserved for dangerous men. Others gave him a wider berth, uncertain what to make of a cook who could apparently handle 6 armed men without breaking a sweat. 3 days after the incident, Tom Bradley appeared at the saloon during the quiet afternoon hours. He found Chun preparing vegetables for the evening stew, his movements precise and meditative as always. Mr. Chun, Tom said quietly, removing his hat and holding it nervously in his hands. I wanted to apologize. For what we did. For what we tried to do. Chun looked up from his work, his pale gray eyes studying Tom's face with the same careful attention he gave to everything else. Your apology is noted, Tom. But apologies change nothing unless they are accompanied by changed behavior. Tom nodded, his face flushed with shame. I'm leaving Deadwood, taking my family and heading back to Colorado. Got word of steady work in the silver mines near Leadville. That is wise, Chun replied. Distance from bad influences often helps a man remember who he truly wishes to be. Tom shifted from foot to foot, clearly wanting to say more, but struggling to find the words. Mr. Chun, what you did that night. I never seen anything like it. How did you learn to fight like that? Chun set down his knife and gave Tom his full attention. Fighting is not what I learned, Tom. I learned discipline. I learned patience. I learned to read the hearts of men and understand what drives them to make the choices they make. The fighting was merely a tool, like this knife I used to prepare food. Tom considered this, his brow furrowed with the effort of understanding. But you could have killed us all, couldn't you? All of us, easy as breathing. Chen's expression grew thoughtful. Yes, he said simply. But killing is a permanent solution to temporary problems. You were angry, frightened men who had made poor choices. Death would have taught you nothing. Fear, properly applied, can be educational. I learned, Tom said quietly. We all learned. Billy's gone home to his mother in St. Louis. Frank's found work on a cattle drive heading north. Pete and Dutch left town together, didn't say where they were going. And Morrison? Chen asked. Tom's face darkened. Still here. Still drinking. Still talking about revenge. But he's talking to empty chairs mostly. Nobody wants to listen anymore. Chen returned to his vegetable preparation, his movements calm and sure. Some men learn from their mistakes, he said. Others are determined to repeat them until they destroy themselves. The choice is always their own. 2 weeks later, Chen was making his evening trip to Patterson's General Store when he encountered Morrison staggering out of the Red Dog Saloon. The former gang leader was drunk again, his right arm still weak from nerve damage that was taking longer to heal than Chen had predicted. Morrison's eyes were bloodshot and wild, his face gaunt from poor eating and steady drinking. You, Morrison snarled when he spotted Chen. This is all your fault. Everything that's happened to me is because of you. Chen stopped walking and regarded Morrison with calm interest. How so? Morrison lurched closer, swaying on his feet, but still attempting to project menace. My boys are gone. Nobody will drink with me. Can't find work because everybody's scared of you. You ruined my life, you yellow devil. Chen studied Morrison's deteriorated appearance, reading the signs of a man who was destroying himself from the inside out. You ruined your own life, Morrison. I merely prevented you from ruining others. Morrison's left hand dropped toward his gun, but the movement was clumsy and obvious. Chen didn't move, didn't change expression, but something in his stillness made Morrison's hand freeze before touching the weapon. I could kill you, Morrison said, though his voice lacked conviction. Yes, Chen agreed. You could attempt it. The outcome would not be what you expect. Morrison stood there swaying, his hand hovering near his gun, his face twisted with impotent rage and desperation. Around them, other pedestrians had noticed the confrontation and moved to safe distances, but nobody seemed particularly concerned for Chen's safety. Go home, Morrison, Chen said gently. Eat something. Sleep. Tomorrow, consider leaving this town and finding a place where you can start fresh. Hatred is poison that you drink hoping others will die. Morrison's hand fell away from his weapon. For a moment, his face showed something almost like human vulnerability. You don't understand, he said quietly. I got nothing left. Nothing. Then you have nothing left to lose, Chen replied. That can be the beginning of freedom, if you choose to see it that way. Without another word, Morrison turned and stumbled away down the street, his shoulders hunched with defeat. Chen watched him go, feeling neither triumph nor satisfaction, only a deep sadness for a man who had chosen to become his own worst enemy. 1 month after the confrontation, Chen received an unexpected visitor. A young Chinese man, perhaps 25 years old, appeared at the saloon's kitchen door during the quiet morning hours. He was well dressed in the American style, but he carried himself with a bearing that Chen recognized immediately. Master Chen, the young man said in Mandarin, bowing deeply. I am Lu Wei. I have traveled from San Francisco seeking your wisdom. Chen studied the visitor's face, reading the intelligence in his eyes and the respect in his posture. How did you know where to find me? Word travels through the community, Lu Wei replied, still speaking in their native language. They say a Shaolin master has made himself known in the frontier town of Deadwood. They say he defeated 6 men without drawing blood. They say he protects the innocent while seeking no glory for himself. Chen sighed, understanding that his carefully maintained anonymity was ending. What do you seek from me, Lu Wei? Training, the young man replied. Guidance. The wisdom to use strength in service of justice rather than personal gain. Chen looked at the eager face before him and saw echoes of his own younger self, filled with righteous purpose and the naive belief that the world's problems could be solved through the proper application of martial skill. Strength without wisdom is mere brutality, Chen said quietly. Wisdom without compassion is mere cleverness. If you wish to learn from me, you must first learn to see the world as it truly is, not as you wish it to be. I understand, Master. No, Chen said with gentle firmness. You believe you understand. True understanding comes only through experience, often painful experience. Are you prepared to have your assumptions about strength and weakness challenged? Lu Wei nodded eagerly, and Chen saw that the young man was indeed prepared to begin the long journey toward real wisdom. Perhaps it was time to accept that his role as a teacher was not yet finished. 3 months after the confrontation, Deadwood had settled into a new equilibrium. The Silver Dollar Saloon prospered as word of Chen's cooking spread throughout the territory, but it also became known as a place where troublemakers were unwelcome. The mere knowledge that the quiet Chinese cook was something far more dangerous than he appeared served as a deterrent to those who might otherwise cause problems. Chen had taken Lu Wei as an apprentice, teaching him both the culinary arts and the deeper mysteries of martial discipline. The young man proved an eager student, though Chen was careful to emphasize philosophy and restraint over combat techniques. One evening, as autumn began to paint the hills around Deadwood with brilliant colors, a new group of strangers arrived at the saloon. They were cowboys, trail-worn and dusty, looking for drinks and a meal after weeks on the range. Their leader was a hard-faced man named Brocker who carried himself with the swagger of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. As the evening progressed and the whiskey flowed, Brocker began making increasingly crude comments about Molly, who was serving tables with her usual professional dignity. His companions laughed at his jokes and encouraged his behavior, the pack mentality that Chen had seen so many times before. But before Brocker could escalate from words to actions, one of the local customers leaned over and whispered something in the cowboy's ear. Brocker's face went pale, and he turned to look toward the kitchen where Chen could be seen calmly preparing food. That's him, Brocker asked in a much quieter voice. The local customer nodded. That's Chen, the one who took apart Morrison's whole gang with his bare hands. Word is he's some kind of Chinese warrior monk. Brocker studied Chen for a long moment, taking in the old man's gentle movements and unassuming appearance. Then he turned back to his drink and made no further comments toward Molly. His companions, sensing their leader's change in mood, settled into quiet conversation about cattle and weather. The evening passed peacefully, with no incidents and no need for intervention. As the cowboys prepared to leave, Brocker approached the bar where Molly was cleaning glasses. "Ma'am," he said politely, tipping his hat. "Thank you for the excellent service. You run a fine establishment here." After they had gone, Molly approached Chen in the kitchen. "Your reputation is spreading," she said with a smile. Chen looked up from the pot he was scrubbing, his expression thoughtful. "Reputation can be a useful tool," he replied, "but it is also a burden. Men will come seeking to test themselves against the legend. Others will come seeking to learn secrets that cannot be taught, only discovered." "Are you concerned?" Molly asked. Chen dried his hands on a clean towel and looked toward the window, where the lights of Deadwood twinkled in the gathering darkness. "I am at peace with the choices I have made," he said quietly. "Sometimes the path to peace requires traveling through conflict. Sometimes protecting innocence demands revealing truths we would prefer to keep hidden." He turned to face her with a gentle smile. "But tonight, there is peace. Tonight, good people can sleep safely in their beds. Tonight, justice has been served without bloodshed. It is enough." Years passed, and Chen's legend grew throughout the territory. The story was told in saloons and mining camps, around campfires, and in newspaper articles, of the Chinese cook who had revealed himself to be a master warrior. Details were added and embellished with each telling, but the core message remained the same. There were consequences for those who preyed upon the innocent. Chen aged gracefully, his hair growing whiter and his movements slightly slower, but his presence remained a stabilizing force in Deadwood. Lu Wei eventually opened his own restaurant in Denver, carrying forward the lessons of both cooking and philosophy that his master had taught him. Other students came and went, some learning the deeper truths Chen offered, others seeking only the surface skills and leaving disappointed. Morrison eventually left town, broken by his own bitterness and unable to rebuild his life in a place where everyone knew his shame. Chen felt no satisfaction in his enemy's defeat, only sadness that a man had chosen self-destruction over self-improvement. Tom Bradley sent occasional letters from Colorado, reporting on his family's progress and thanking Chin for the lesson that had set his life on a better path. Billy Cartwright wrote from St. Louis, where he had found honest work and reconciled with his mother. Even Dutch Henry was heard from once, a brief note saying he had found work on a ranch in Montana and was trying to make amends for his past. The Silver Dollar Saloon became more than just a place to eat and drink. It became a symbol of the frontier justice that protected the weak and held the strong accountable for their actions. Chin's Kitchen became a place where travelers could find not just excellent food, but wisdom and perspective from a man who had seen the best and worst of human nature. On a quiet spring evening, as Chin prepared for another day's work, he reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He had sought peace and found it, though not in the way he had expected. He had tried to hide from his violent past, only to discover that sometimes the past must be embraced to protect the future. The young monks at the Shaolin Temple had taught him that true strength came from within, that external power was meaningless without internal discipline. Here in Deadwood, he had learned that strength used in service of others was no strength at all. A new group of travelers entered the saloon, dusty from the road and looking for trouble in their eyes. But before they could speak, one of the local customers whispered a word of warning. The troublemakers looked toward the kitchen, saw the quiet Chinese cook preparing vegetables with meditative precision, and decided that perhaps they would prefer a different establishment for their evening entertainment. Chin smiled to himself as he worked. The reputation that had once been a burden had become a shield, protecting not just himself but everyone who sought refuge in this small corner of the frontier. Peace, he had learned, was not the absence of conflict. Peace was the knowledge that when conflict came, there would always be those willing to stand between predators and prey. Peace was the understanding that strength guided by wisdom could triumph over strength guided by cruelty. Peace was a choice, made new each day, by ordinary people who chose to be extraordinary when the moment demanded it. If you enjoyed this tale of hidden strength protecting the innocent, please like this video and subscribe for more stories of justice and courage. We bring you tales of ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things when faced with impossible odds. Until next time, remember that true warriors fight not for glory, but for those who cannot fight for themselves.